Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's Ukraine War news updates for the 17th of June 2024, first part thereof. We'll get to where we normally start, Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply, you can find them in the description to the video below. We have just over 1,000 personnel lost by the Russians, 2 tanks, so that 1,080 is about where we've seen it for the last week now, sort of flickering around just above 1,000, just below 1,000. Ticked up a little bit, I think, yesterday, but back down to nearer 1,000. 2 tanks lost. We had 0 tanks yesterday, which is quite it was a step away from what we have seen. It's very rare that we have had days where there have been 0 tanks. I know some people said that's the first time, but it's not as far as I know. But 2 tanks, 0 tanks, then 2 tanks possibly should tell us something. 18 armoured personnel vehicles is certainly fewer in that category than we have seen over the last month, although it's still just above average. And 14 artillery systems is well below what we have seen. So something's happening here, maybe. 0 multiple launch rocket systems and anti-aircraft warfare systems. This could be the Monday effect from Sunday yesterday. We could have had a weekend effect that we haven't had for some time. Maybe the Ukrainians are not feeling like their backs against the wall. There is some kind of breathing room at the moment, and that means their statistics accumulation and synthesizing is taking a bit of a backseat, or there is just it is just slightly quieter along the front lines. We have 24 vehicles and fuel tanks, 12 pieces of special equipment. So 24 vehicles and fuel tanks is very low for that category compared to what we have seen, right? And 12 pieces of special equipment is fairly high there, but it's a bit of an anomalous category, really, in terms of what it can include. So I don't quite know what to make of this. It could be that the Russians are just not pushing as much as they have been in as many places as they have been. We could be seeing some kind of culmination, although they are still attacking in certain places, and we'll see that in a short while. Or, as I say, it could be some other reason. Let me know what you guys think. As far as the loss list from Andrew Perpetua is concerned, we have something approaching parity, actually, which is a little bit of a rarity for the time, for these last, I guess, this last month and a half since the beginning of that offensive up in Kharkiv. Although the offensive up in Kharkiv has not been expensive for the Russians in terms of equipment, they haven't really thrown too much equipment into that sector. They have thrown an awful lot of infantry. It's been a very much infantry-led attack, that one. But the Russians have been consistently losing stupendous amounts of equipment elsewhere. Now, there isn't a crazy amount of equipment on this list from the Russians today, so that kind of goes in line with what we've seen for the last 2 days, with particularly in a tank category. Although, yeah, we've got 3 tanks there, so we've had 0 and 2 tanks the last 2 days, so that kind of tracks. Anyway, for the Ukrainian list of losses, we have a radar N TPQ-36 hit by Lancet. Lancet's still hitting those fairly high value targets in that medium range. Also an M777 lost to a Lancet there too, and another couple of howitzers. I say lost, it's damaged. Another one hit by a Lancet. It struck the defensive gate, and I'm not sure how much that it is damaged beyond that. It's difficult to tell sometimes with howitzers how damaged they get, especially with things like Lancets or any FPV drones. Quite variable in their destructive capabilities in terms of their payload. Lancets we've seen bouncing off things and doing minimal damage or doing fundamental damage to a system. With howitzers, though, especially towed howitzers particularly, especially, they are quite simple bits of kit compared to a self-propelled howitzer that is basically a tank with the barrel and the howitzer part of it. So there's a lot more to go wrong. And when you hit a towed howitzer, you can sometimes hit, one of its feet or the towing part of it, if you like. I don't know the technical word for that. And that can, I guess, damage it to some degree, but that's quite a thick bit of metal and there's not a lot of moving parts there. Rather than hitting say, the loading mechanism that's going to cause more of an issue. So quite often you can see towed artillery get hit, but you're unsure as to whether you're actually stopping it from working at all, which is different from a self-propelled howitzer that becomes fairly self-evident if it turns into burning hulk, which is much more likely because it also carries the ammunition on board. With towed howitzers, you're going to want to keep the ammunition slightly far away from the howitzer to stop stuff like this happening, and then you lug over a few when you're actually firing. But a lancet's not going to blow both the howitzer and the ammunition up, whereas that can happen with a self-propelled howitzer. I know I've said that before, but always worth repeating. Infantry fighting vehicle, BTR-4, and then a bunch of civilian vehicles. So nothing particularly too high value apart from maybe that radar thrown in there. Of course, any radar being hit is going to hurt. And with the Russians, quite a bit of electronic warfare equipment there and surveillance and comm stuff, repeater antenna, Muron P, comms equipment, so on and so forth. And we come down to unmanned ground vehicle thrown in. I've got that. I should have that in our list here. One carrying mines that was hit with an FPV drone. Then we got a BM-21 Grad multiple launch rocket system damaged. A few tanks, a few BMPs, a few BTRs. And and that's pretty much that. Usual couple of, well, actually far fewer trucks and civilian vehicles and ATVs than we sometimes see. So this is a much smaller list of losses here that tracks, as I say, with the general staff figures over the last couple of days. That BRDM 2M is an interesting one. So it's abandoned after prior first-person view damage and then hit with a night vision drone. You quite often see these ones that, well, first of all, actually, it's important to note that most of the Russian equipment is destroyed and not abandoned or damaged. So that's good news. And actually, abandoned usually turns into destroyed because you abandon it and then it gets hit by another FPV drone or at some other point. Or it gets abandoned due to a mine hit, but then the FPV drones or night vision drones take them out later. Now although we haven't seen any today, there have been days where we've had quite a high number of excavators on the loss lists. And I was talking about how that's more likely up north of Vovchansk, where the Russians have gone into Ukrainian land and then trying to take these cities and villages, or towns and villages like Vovchansk and other places, Hliobike. And then as they're fighting in those settlements, they are building fortifications behind. And so excavators are getting hit quite frequently in that area. And here we have Ukrainian FPV, no dig zone, Russian fortifications north of Vovchansk, a cemetery of excavators. So just in that one image, you've got there are at least 3 excavators there that have been taken out. So that's where I think most of the excavators are coming from on the loss lists. Ukraine is using a lot of hammer-glided guide bombs in Vovchansk. So we've got this source here. I presume it's a Russian source. Still waiting if the maneuver in Kharkiv is a genius general staff plan. I'm not sure, but War Translated here has this. In the Kharkiv, I mean, that's a Ukrainian version of the spelling. In the Kharkiv direction, one of the most intense battles of the SMO, well, they call it SMO, it's a Russian source, takes place, which can be compared with Bakhmut and Avdiivka. One interesting thing, our VKS, Russian Air Force, so yeah, attacked the enemy with more than 100 FABs for the guided glide bombs per day, mainly in the rear areas and concentrations of troops. This is good. The bad news is that the enemy has a lot of his own guided hammer bombs, which also pose a serious problem. It's not easy to fight them. In other words, electronic warfare doesn't work very well because they have secondary guidance after the GPS, so they can use, I think, inertial systems. I'm still waiting that the maneuvers near Kharkiv are a brilliant plan of the General Staff for a diversionary strike. In other words, we've got, okay, simply put, both sides are using a lot of guided glide bombs. The Ukrainians using more than they previously have. These hammer bombs seem to be doing quite well for the Ukrainians. So that is, I suppose, good news for the Ukrainians in that they have upped their use of those bombs. Bad news for the Ukrainians that the Russians are using a lot as well, which is not unusual. And then, of course, the idea that I'm still waiting to see if this is a good idea. The brilliant geniusness of the Kharkiv offensive. In other words, you've got a Russian source here saying there's no evidence that this is a good move, which tracks with my evaluation that it's an operational disaster. Yet to have realised any positive outcome for the Russians, really, given the amount of losses they are taking. Now, footage of likely TOS, TOS, that's a thermobaric multiple launch rocket system, or a UMPK glide bomb strikes in Vovchansk. So either or it could be both. And really, you've got thermobaric or large guided glide bombs. And actually, the Russians are using some really sizable munitions along the front line. I'm going to show you a 1,500 kilogram guided glide bomb in a second. So that is Vovchansk getting absolutely hammered by both sides. Actually, where is that? I'm sure. No. I might have it in the strikes. I think it's in the strikes one. In Liman, the Russians, it's just a huge bomb that they've used there. So going on to this BRDM2. So in another potential sign of vehicle shortages, Russian forces have started using 1960s era BRDM2 armoured scout cars as infantry mobility vehicles in the Sokil area. So the Sokil area is the is north of the Avdiivka salient, and these are, these four-wheeled old school 1960s scout cars are being used. And again, we need to ask, is this because it's the best thing to use or because you have to? And surely it's because you have to, right? And if it's because you have to, it means you are lacking the other equipment that you should be using instead, like an infantry fighting vehicle, like a BMP-3 ideally. But no, they're using a 1960s scout car. This can only surely indicate that they are losing, or they have lost, a significant amount of equipment to the point where they're having to use really old crappy stuff. There are still, on this list of losses, there's still 3 ATVs here. You've got 2 golf carts and a quad. What are you doing using them when you should be using something far better? What are you doing using a BRDM when you should be using a BMP-3? Well, interestingly, 4 BMP-3s have been lost here, 3 destroyed and 1 abandoned, so that's going to be lost. Now, 4 BMP-3s is interesting considering we know from satellite imagery that there are no BMP-3s left in Russian storage. They have there's 0 BMP-3s. Okay, they're down to about 1,200 of essentially BMP-1s that are not in very good nick left to pull from. Things are not looking good for the Russian stockpiles. So yeah, I think that does tell you a story there. Yeah, of note, until today, only 12 Russian BRDMs have been recorded destroyed by Oryx. So it is not a very common to see the BRDM, because they are, someone else says up to now, only 7 have been visually confirmed as lost. So this will be 8. So difference between Oryx and actually Richard Vareka uses war spotting. So either way, not many have been seen because they are super old school. You might have seen some being used by the LPR, DPR, something like that. They might have been handed down some pretty cruddy stuff, or had that available when they became the LPR and DPR, Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic. But yeah, not a good sign for the Russians, I would wager. And along with that, says Andrew Perpetua, along with the BRDM-2M used to transport troops to and from combat, they all died. So he seems to have imagery to suggest that when it was hit during the daytime, I think it was hit, then abandoned. Actually, he seems to think that all the troops associated with that died. So again, when we see large losses of vehicles, I mean, today's not a particularly, it's very low numbers of equipment lost, but when we're seeing those days where the lists are like this, you've got to remember that for an amount of those vehicles, there were people in and on them, and there will be deaths and injuries associated with them. I saw an image, I don't know if it's an old one actually, but it was a montage of tanks getting destroyed this morning, and one of them was just like piles of people on top, and a first-person view drone hit it like right on those piles of people, and it fundamentally, like, the whole thing went up, right? And you're like, that's one tank on the list, but that may be 10 people plus that are at least very injured, because that fundamentally exploded. And in that particular case, I guess that they all died. So these lists do also represent personnel losses as well, quite often. Not all the time. Sometimes they're already been abandoned and they're then destroyed thereafter. Okay, what else to look at in the sort of losses? In Novomykhailivka area, so that's on the sort of bottom end of the Donetsk, the eastern front, Russian forces attempted to storm Ukrainian positions with a mechanized column, but faced significant losses. The 72nd Brigade reported that Russians lost one tank, 4 BMPs, and 1 NTLB. So that 6 vehicles there. Additionally, a number of infantry soldiers were lost during the assault, and then that kind of goes into what I was saying about the number of personnel that can be lost during these strikes on vehicles. So more destruction of Russian equipment there in another attack. I don't know how many vehicles attacked there, but a few times recently we've seen a little bit of an uptick. So where I was saying that they're only ever attacking in 1s, 2s and 3s at the moment, and they were doing that. Now we've seen a couple of instances where maybe 16 were used, or around that number. 19 were used in Mariinka, but then 14 of them got destroyed. So even when they do use a lot of vehicles, the loss proportion of them that are lost is just unsustainably high. I don't know about this attack, how many were used, but it's a few more than obviously 3 or so. So they evidently are, it seems, stockpiling to some degree to try and do more meaningful attacks. But again, that's still not the 30s that we were seeing previously, the 50s. Now, even in October last year in the Avdiivka offensive, they when the Russians were losing huge numbers of equipment, they were attacking with insignificant numbers, and we're just not seeing that. We are, however, seeing a first turtle tank be captured here. This is something that the Ukrainians will be poring over to check out all the very finest technology that's on board. First captured Russian turtle tank along with its crew by the 22nd Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine. Indeed, this is it. It appears Russian nanotechnology captured by Ukraine and now will be transferred to NATO headquarters for research purposes. So that's good news there. But yeah, just another incredible example of this sort of Mad Max scenario whereby the Russians are constructing all sorts of interesting looking vehicles. Going on to another bit of footage. This is the Strela 10. So the Strela 10 is used by both sides, Soviet era piece of kit, short-range air defense system. This is an incredible bit of footage. That looks like it's just been superimposed, bit of Photoshop, but that's a missile fired at this FPV drone and missing it. And it just goes to show how difficult it is to shoot down these small drones, or perhaps how unimpressive some of the equipment being used indeed by both sides really is. It's not the first time I've seen this, actually. I've seen a number of Strela 10 misses. Donetsk Oblast, a Russian 9M37 surface-to-air missile from a Strela 10 passes within a few feet of a Ukrainian drone but fails to detonate. And this is it. This is the footage here. So we'll look at this because I think it should be all right to do so. So the drone is there looking on, I presume it's a reconnaissance drone, and you think, oh, your time is not long for this world. You are going to get it in the face here. And indeed, the missile misses. There you go. I mean, that's not unusual, right? They're not going to have 100% hit rates, but it goes to show how challenging it is when you have so many drones in the sky. And you have to try and take them out, because otherwise they're either spotting for this Strela 10 to be hit, or they're an FPV drone ready to hit that Strela 10. So this then gets out of dodge, that vehicle, because it knows it's been seen. So you're firing these much more expensive missiles against the drone because you have to. But how often do they not hit, and how much is that costing in this case, the Russians in terms of armaments? Atash carried out a sabotage in Smolensk. Partisans destroyed a relay cabinet and a railway near Smolensk. The railway is in this area is an important transport corridor connecting the central part of Russia with the northwestern regions. The work of the companies Transneft, Gazprom, Rostec directly depends on this branch, including the production and transfer of military equipment from the central regions to the Russian Federation. So good news there that there's sabotage still going on, affecting Russian logistics. Long may that continue. And then we have another Russia on fire. We haven't had a big burning enterprise for some day. So here's a big car wash in Moscow trying to denazify itself. That seems to be a pretty big fire again in Moscow region. Goodness me, surely that's telling you Putin something. Right, moving on to strikes. Relatively quiet night really for both sides. Although during the night, Ukrainian GUR drones did attack military facilities in Belgorod, Voronezh and Lipetsk regions of Russia. The targeted enterprises included the Novolipetsk metallurgical plant and a local tractor factory, both of which are used for military purposes. So tractor factories are commonly a euphemism for, BMP repair plant or manufacturing plants. They co-opted for the manufacturing of military vehicles. The 3 other attacks by Ukraine on sites inside Russia earlier today, said Tim White. So he talks about that. It says that 3 drones were shot down. But I guess more information on that will trickle out. Now, Belgorod has been hit, I think, partly with the regular kind of military operations, as in there'll be both multiple launched rockets and artillery flying across the border, as well as strikes with things like the HIMARS released missiles. I don't know what's been used here, but an ammo depot is reportedly hit, so quite significant amounts of billowing smoke there. I don't know if this is the same strike, but someone says in Belgorod, Russia, a warehouse with Iranian ammunition was hit. So it could be Shaheeds kept there. It could be Iranian missiles or artillery ammunition. Who knows? Now, a couple of claims as to where this is. Some saying Rostov region, some saying Lipetsk, which is up north of Belgorod, if I remember correctly. So someone's not quite right here. But we have a town which is lit up, and then something really explodes in the background that looks like an electrical explosion, like a substation being hit, and then the lights go out. It cycles back on to the beginning of the video again quite quickly. So you get the point there. Night became day, and then became darkest night in the Russian city of Lipetsk after Ukrainian drones paid a visit to the electrical infrastructure there. We have a 1,500 kilogram thermobaric bomb going off in Liman. This is incredibly challenging for the Ukrainians. The size of the explosion for these huge, 1,500 kilogram of thermobaric munition is not a nice thing to see. And so Liman really under a lot of pressure there. That was one of the primary places recaptured in the Kharkiv counteroffensive, the lightning counteroffensive that took place so long ago now, it seems. So I presume Liman is getting back to some degree of normality and then getting absolutely hammered there, which is a real shame. Now, why have we not seen so many cruise missiles be used? Well, I've talked often about how the loading facilities in Sevastopol have been rendered somewhat useless because the fleet is now hot-footed it down to Novorossiysk, and they don't have the loading facilities for cruise missiles there, although there are now claims that they have built them in place so they can load up the submarines and cruise missile carrying ships now. But that could explain why we've not seen a lot of cruise missiles sent by Russia, just a concentration on more ballistic missiles. And this is certainly appears to be part of the situation. So military spokesman Platenchuk told RBK it's partly due to the relocation of the Russian naval base to Novorossiysk, while missiles and charging systems stayed in Crimea, but also that Caliber missiles themselves are simply less effective. So his claim here is the nuance is that the effectiveness of these missiles is no longer as high as it was at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. We have already learned to counter them, and they mostly use caliber during combined missile attacks in order to achieve success in numbers to overload air defense. They might have some chance, they think, but as an independent type of weapon, caliber is actually no longer used. In other words, when they are doing these larger, overwhelming attacks with missiles and Shahis, and they will use caliber as a way of overwhelming the defenses and getting the defenses to use up their valuable interceptors. And then so you may use the calibers first, or the drones first, and calibers, and then you have your Kinzhaus and your ballistic missiles coming through afterwards. But they don't. The implication here is that the Russians don't generally use them independently of those large waves of missiles. So the days where we'd see like 6 calibers, we quite often see that. In fact, I wonder if the Dell stats will bear this out. We just don't seem to be seeing an awful lot of cruise missiles. So here's your cruise missiles. It's probably gonna, around this kind of period, you had a lot of these days. You do see, I don't know if cruise missiles here, though, it now includes other than caliber or different types of missiles or the aeroballistic missiles, because actually, my guess is what you're seeing now is fewer caliber cruise missiles and more of these other types of missiles, including Kinzhal, but not just Kinzhal. You've got your Iskanders, you've got your KH-69s, your anti-ship missiles that are used. So I think the Russians are just changing the types of missiles they use to make sure they use ones that are much more likely to get through. And when you have these times of using fewer missiles, that they won't be your caliber cruise missiles. Whereas back here, when you had these routine attacks with, so what is that, sort of 16, 15, 20, around this kind of period, there will be, I would have thought, predominantly cruise missiles, and Ukraine was not so good at shooting the cruise missiles down as they are now, as you expect them to be later on in the war, with the West giving them more and more technology and more pieces of kit to deal with that, radars and different types of air defense systems, that they'll just be better at shooting down those cruise missiles. So interesting claim there from Platenchuk. Right, let's move on to other bits and pieces. Russia is raising taxes to keep the war going. According to British intelligence, Russia expects the tax changes to generate about $29 billion in additional budget revenues in 2025. To accomplish this, the corporate income tax rate will increase from 20% to 25%. So that's a huge increase. That sounds like 5%, but it's not. It's an increase of 25%. As in, a quarter of 20% is 5%, and that's what you're adding on to 20% to make 25%. So the percentage increase is a 25% increase to get you from 20% to 25%. And that's huge. It's not like a 0.25% or something. That's just a massive hit. Highest corporate tax rate will rise from 15% to 22%. Goodness me. So this is another sign that all is not going well in Russia, that they are struggling to finance this war, that yes, they're on a war footing, but they need to produce far more than they presently are, and they need to finance that with far more money than they presently have. And so, yeah, it was the worst decision. Putin invading in 2022 was just a massive example of economic and national suicide, I think. And another example of how desperate they are, or you could argue how clever they are in a way, in taking people in that aren't indigenous Russians so they don't upset their own population. But I don't know if they would be doing this so much of it if they weren't so desperate. A frank interview with a Somali mercenary Adil in the Russian army who was captured in Ukraine. The guy's not stupid. He explains the situation with recruiting foreigners in Russian with ease. It's very simple to get to Russia. Just a week and your tourist visa is ready. So there's an expedition expediting these these applications because Russia is so desperate for these people. Yeah, it'll only take a week and then you get your tourist visa, job done. People see advertisements for war and the army everywhere in Russia. Many foreigners do not immediately understand that this is an army and not some kind of security organization. No one gave specifics about whether he would go to the front or remain in Russia. The man was promised a passport and money. For him, it was a real dream. He thought he'd live like a king back home. So here's a guy from Somalia who's possibly not used to an awful lot, gets to find out that you can go to Russia, get a tourist visa quite easily, and maybe earn some money, and then this advertising that he can join the army and get paid this much money. Does that, thinks that this is going to be great, doesn't really understand there's a big war going on and he's going to be thrown into the front line. He says nobody explains the motivation for fighting in Ukraine. Adil had no idea who was fighting whom and for what. So we might think this is freaking obvious, right? Because we're obsessed with the war and spend 12 hours a day with our head in war news, right? Probably more than that. So we know everything that's going on, but your random from some part of the world is just concerned with the daily existence and thinking, right, I need to become some kind of economic migrant. Things are really difficult here at home, wherever I live. Where are the options? Oh, look at all the places that are easy to get to in the world. It is probable that Russia's opened up their economy to migration because of the massive labour shortages. We've heard that they are indeed doing this, but it's not just about getting labour into work, it's getting labour into work in the army as well. And so many of these people are seeing Russia as an easy place to get to, going there and then getting sucked into fighting in the army or joining the army because it's very attractive for them. They're having to compete with the open economy in terms of attracting people to work in the army. So they give these packages that someone from Somalia is going to be thinking, this is amazing, I'm going to live like a king, but doesn't really understand that they're just going to be sent to their deaths. Training was only 7 weeks, very limited. Adil thought it couldn't be that he was being deceived, but they were thrown onto the front line almost immediately, and Adil calls these days hell. If you get injured, only God will help you. There's a 0% desire to try and save your life. Very interesting there. So the very frank understanding that if you get injured, you're done for. Russians aren't interested in saving you because I guess from a really cynical point of view, particularly if you're like a Somali fighter and not a indigenous Russian, but even then could be the same where you see someone injured, you're thinking, right, I've got to risk 2 or 3 of my men to get that person out, and so they could then become injured and die. And when I do get that person out, then all the resources required to get them back to health, and then we've got to pay compensation, and then blah 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 blah. So you're thinking from a macro view of this, is like, do I risk all that and then it doesn't actually pay? It actually pays in a sense. The opportunity cost, if you like, it pays to leave an injured person alone to their certain death. And then you don't know where they are. You're not paying anyone, especially if it's a Somali, and that's them on the battlefield to be discovered in 2 years' time or something like that. That's my speculation. Maxar, who's a satellite image company, continues to sell satellite images of the territory of Ukraine to the Russians, says Sternenko here. The problem that with American satellite companies has been known for a long time, and the US government could solve this problem if it wanted. I personally think this is probably a bit of a free market problem. It's exactly the same issue with sanctioned goods of any type. Any kind of widget that gets used in a Russian weapon will find its way to Russia, despite how many sanctions you put in place, because it's so difficult. You sell it to someone, he sells it to someone else, sells it to someone else, and then it goes to another country like Kyrgyzstan, and then across the border into Russia. Well, actually, here we're talking about digital stuff, digital products. So these are satellite images that are even easier. Like you get hold of satellite imagery and then you send it by email to an encrypted account, and you get paid. Job done. No, how difficult would that be to stop that happening? I think it would be incredibly difficult, because Maxar would have to prove that the Russians had that satellite imagery, and then you'd have to prove where it came from. And they can't prove. What's happening is that there's speculation going, well, these satellites showed these things and then these things were here, and so it's highly likely that they've got access to these. But it's not like they found these satellite images in the waste paper basket of a Russian strike facility. Like, that's not what's happening. So I think it's easy to say the problem with American satellite companies has been known for a long time, and the US government could solve this problem. It probably could do a lot more to do something about this, but I'm sure they know about this. It's going to be insanely difficult. Either you have private satellite imagery companies, or you don't. You have them completely controlled by governments. So if you've got a private industry where people are consuming the products of satellite imagery around the world, particularly in Ukraine, you are going to get this problem, and it's going to be so difficult to solve because of the reasons I've said. Right, Ben Hodges says another reason Russia should not be able to keep Crimea is to cut off its illegal shipments of stolen grain. This is yet another analysis here. Russian state showing Russian-owned United Shipbuilding subsidiary Astrakhan, based CMC's Russian flag Handymax bulker Matros Shevchenko. So basically, a boat that's owned by the Russians here is transiting the Bosphorus. So the straits, the tiny little gap into the Black Sea in Istanbul, after delivering 27,000 tons of plundered wheat from occupied Sevastopol to Tartus in Syria. So Tartus is one of these ports that the Russians use extensively to, I've talked about how Russia is only involved in Syria because of the warm water ports that they have access to. And I talk about that in terms of their Russian naval fleet, military influence from Syria to the Mediterranean, Suez Canal, Straits of Gibraltar. It's how they can access and influence that part of the world. That's why Crimea is so freaking important, because it gives them that and they own it, whereas they don't own Syria. But that's why they're in Syria, involved in the war there, because they want to maintain that. But it's not just for military purposes, it's for economic trade purposes. It's a port where you can do anything dodgy you like. The Russians can use their oil, their ghost fleets of oil and grain cargo to do dodgy trade. So Syria is very useful for the Russians. Okay, I've talked extensively about the Putin paradox. The better that the Ukrainians do, unfortunately, the more likely it means that Russia will press the red button, that Putin will do something insane. And this is now being quite openly talked about. Putin can strike with nuclear weapons if the Russian Federation loses in Ukraine, the head of the National Security and Defense Council, Alexander Litvinenko, stated. Ukraine Security Council Secretary doesn't rule out Russia using nuclear arms if facing, quote, catastrophic defeat. And that's the point. Nothing can be ruled out if Russia finds itself on the verge of a catastrophic defeat, including the use of tactical nuclear weapons by Moscow, according to Litvinenko in an interview with The Times. At the same time, the official said that Russia's defeat on the battlefield would not automatically lead to the use of nuclear weapons, as Putin could try to convince his people of an ongoing course of events as a victory. And here's the issue. So you're trying to second guess, you're trying to war game the situation where you're thinking, well, this is what we really want to happen. We want Russia to have a catastrophic defeat. We want them to be kicked out of Crimea. But then, of course, if that happens, Putin's going to be thinking, right, I'm going to lose my political position here. This is this is what I've talked about before. This is so super important. The war for Zelensky himself, on a personal note, is not an existential war. It's an existential war for the country and the identity. But if Ukraine were to lose the war, I think Zelensky would up sticks and move to another country, right? And he'll be fine. As an individual, he is fine. But for Putin, if Russia fundamentally lose this war, like if it's a catastrophic defeat, this is an existential threat to Putin. It's this weird situation where the war is not an existential threat to Russia. Like Russia could pull out of Ukraine and it would continue surviving. If Russia were to stop fighting, Russia would survive. If Ukraine were to stop fighting, Ukraine would cease to exist. So it's existential for Ukraine, but not for Russia. But it's existential for Putin and not for Zelensky. So you've got this weird scenario where it kind of flips. And if Russia were to fundamentally, catastrophically lose this war, Putin would be deposed. That he would be, that's his legacy gone. He'll be, there'll be an absolute disaster politically. You could get an uprising. He'd end up in a gulag or killed or something. And so therefore, he's going to make decisions that align rationally with that scenario. So you might think he's not a rational actor. I would argue Putin is a rational actor. He just has a very different set of variables that he's playing around with in his life that's different to how we might see things. But it is rational. Just, yeah, garbage in, garbage out. So he will more likely make a crazy decision based on the fact that, I'm going to get deposed and killed anyway. So if it's all going really bad, I'm just going to go nuclear, quite literally. And that's a real worry. And so therefore that factors into how the US, I mean, this is why you've got people like Jake Sullivan being anti-escalatory. Like, I do understand it. It's just how much confidence do you have that Putin would do things like this? So many other people are like, we can push the envelope, Putin won't do anything. And someone like Jake Sullivan is like, well, actually, he is more likely to do something. But then the more you push the envelope, the more likely it is. So at the moment, nothing's happening. But even if it's a small but significant risk of something happening, that something is nuclear war. So you've got to be really careful. You know, it's not to dismiss the nuclear threat at all. And the better Russia, the better Ukraine do, significantly better they do, the more likely it is that Putin does this crazy stuff. And this is being admitted here effectively by Ukraine's Security Council. Yeah, something to ponder. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Take care. Speak soon.